A billionaire who swore he'd never need anyone is brought to his knees when the only person who can save him is the daughter he denied before she took her first breath. Will mercy win, or will memory burn too deep? Before we dive in, please subscribe, like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps these stories reach more people. In the heat-hazed rush of Lagos, where cranes peck at the sky and traffic sings like a restless choir, Tunde Balogun lived as if the city itself wore his initials. Two construction empires, convoys of black SUVs, dinners where senators laughed too loudly at his jokes. He measured love in contracts and respect in retainer fees, polishing his reflection before a wall of smoked glass and whispering the creed that had raised him higher than billboards: power buys everything. He believed it the way a sailor believes the horizon: inevitable, obedient, his. Years earlier, work had ferried him inland, an opulent royal project in Imo State. And there, just past dawn, a girl at the stream disrupted his symmetry. Kamsi, barefoot and sure, balanced a silver bowl the way prayer balances a heart. When she declined his window-tinted charm with a silence that stung, pride woke like a hornet. He returned the next day, and the next, playing tenderness like a role, promises varnished with patience, smiles the color of easy sunshine. She made one simple demand: "If you mean us, meet my parents." He said yes, and steered toward a softer, selfish road. By the time he rolled back to Lagos, he had left behind an envelope and a wound. Cash could clog a conscience, but not undo a night. Kamsi swallowed shame the way the city swallows rain, quietly, while the world hurries past. Weeks thickened, the calendar turned into a sentence. Her father's verdict arrived like a slammed door: bring the man in 2 market days or leave his house. And so at dawn, she folded a dress and a prayer into a small bag, clutched the business card he'd tucked into that brown envelope like a dare, and boarded a bus whose windows framed her future as a blur. At the mansion gate, a uniformed voice became granite: "He doesn't know you." The metal groaned shut. The street took her in. Beside a shuttered kiosk, a food seller named Mama Tyra asked no questions that could bruise and offered rice the way mercy is offered: warm, cheap, enough. That night, a city of 20 million thinned to 2 women and 1 frightened heartbeat. By morning, the frightened heartbeat had found a rhythm. In a hospital lit too brightly for secrets, Kamsi brought forth a girl with eyes that didn't blink at storms. She named her Ijeoma, good journey, because names can be instructions, because there are bridges you must cross even when the planks complain. Under Mama Tyra's roof, Kamsi learned the arithmetic of survival. 20 plates at lunch means rent by Friday. A smile softens the price of pepper. Sleep is a loan you repay in yawns. She taped affirmations over the mirror: God keeps time, not shame. And when gossip came sniffing, she fed it silence until it starved. Ijeoma grew among measuring cups and medical leaflets the clinic left behind, tracing bones on photocopied diagrams and quizzing her mother with the seriousness of small profits. It was Kamsi who taught her to lace shoes and say please, Mama Tyra who taught her that kindness is a verb, and Lagos who taught her to walk fast without appearing to run. Across the years, Tunde's name embroidered itself on glass towers and gala backdrops. But power ages badly when it doesn't learn humility. His second marriage was glossy as a magazine and just as thin. When his kidneys failed, the monitors spoke a grammar money couldn't bribe. He lay in a room where everyone wears the same gown and the same fear, where titles become first names and first names become wristbands, and he practiced a word he rarely used: help, like a foreign phrase he wished he'd learned earlier. On a Monday that smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain, a doctor with steady hands and calm vowels opened his chart and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Balogun. I'm Dr. Ijeoma Tyra." The name struck him like distant thunder, familiar, then gone, just as her eyes, bright and unflustered, tugged at a thread he thought he'd buried beneath marble and mirrors. He signed the consent forms with a hand that finally trembled, not from illness alone, but from the soft, collapsing sound of a story turning back on itself. Somewhere in the arithmetic of consequence, The sum had come due, and the receipt wore a white coat.
Morning at Mama Taira's shop began before sunrise, when the city still yawned and the air tasted like unboiled tea. Kamsi swept dust into small obedient piles, set pots to shimmer, and counted rice by the rhythm of prayer, while Ijoma, long-legged now, a teenager who had learned to fold herself small in crowded spaces, arranged plastic chairs as if laying out choices for the day. Sit, eat, stay, be kind. School sat on one side of Ijoma's horizon and the shop on the other, and she walked the tightrope between them with a grace that made strangers trust her with their spilled soups and secret aches. She memorized biology terms in chalky whispers between orders: nephron, glomerulus, homeostasis, then dashed outside to coax a bus conductor into buying a bowl before his route swallowed his appetite. Customers knew to ask her for bandages when knives forgot their manners, for paracetamol when headaches spoke louder than bosses, and for the kind of listening that isn't nosy but necessary. After all, the shop was also a waiting room for people who couldn't afford to wait anywhere else. Mama Taira taught Ijoma to price fairly and smile with her eyes, to recognize men who paid late but always paid, and to recognize the rare woman who needed a free plate more than a lecture. Kindness is a ledger, she said, and God balances it overnight. Kamsi kept other ledgers: the rent book, the school fees, the careful list of small losses you don't name because naming gives them teeth, and she kept them without bitterness, only with that sturdy tenderness of women who build without applause. When Ijoma's grades began to rank in the top 5, the principal called her a knife made of light and handed her a scholarship form thick with boxes, the kind that dares you to dream in ink. Kamsi and Ijoma filled it at the counter after closing, the lamplight turning their shadows long and brave, and when the acceptance letter arrived months later, the city seemed to clap: horns, hawkers, the obedient hiss of the kettle. Medical college was a new map. Anatomy labs cool as cathedrals, a library that smelled like rain trapped in paper, seniors who were generous with mnemonics and stingy with sleep, and Ijoma kept a photo of Kamsi and Mama Taira tucked in her pharmacology text like a talisman against doubt. She learned protocols and pulse rhythms, the difference between pain that complains and pain that whispers, and she learned to say, "We'll figure it out," to patients who feared invoices more than diagnoses, then walked to the social worker's office like a petition in shoes. On weekends, she returned to the shop in scrubs streaked with small victories, lifting pots and spirits, reviewing flashcards while the stew negotiated with the fire. Some nights, when the city forgot to be loud, she asked careful questions that didn't stab. Was he kind before he wasn't? And do you ever want to go back to the village? Kamsi answered with measured honesty, protecting her daughter from the sharpest edges while refusing to pretend the blade was a feather. "We live forward," she'd say, then add, softer, "but we remember." Years stretched, scaffolding rose, and with it Tunde's empire. But so did its hairline fractures. A project rushed because pride hates permits. A partner who preferred press releases to pillars. A balance sheet that smiled until it didn't. He married a woman whose laughter sounded like expensive glass. For a time they matched each other's surfaces, public, polished, photogenic, until illness insisted on truth. The first collapse came on a Wednesday, inconvenient and unglamorous. The ambulance lights turned his driveway into a confession and the hospital into a democracy where everyone wore the same gown and mortality spoke without a microphone. Ijoma, now Dr. Taira, had learned to still her hands and quiet her face. She presented rounds with clipped clarity and kept a private softness folded under her coat like a note only she could read. She met Tunde professionally first, vitals, labs, plan, then went home and set the name on the table between dinner and silence. Kamsi lifted it like an old box and placed it back down, unwilling to open it yet. But her eyes said the archive was real. Meanwhile, at the shop, regulars asked after the doctor child, pride leaking from their voices, as if her progress belonged to the street the way rain belongs to gutters. Mama Taira started a tip jar labeled "Girls in White Coats" and dared any man to question the theology of that. In school clinics and on public health outreaches, Ijoma touched hands that had held machetes and babies and steering wheels, taught teenagers to find their own pulse and mothers to trust fevers less than fluids. And each time she witnessed a small mercy, blood pressure dropping, a cough that surrendered, she felt a seam inside her stitched tighter. The city tested them in petty ways, spoiled generators, inflated tomatoes, a landlord with a talent for surprise inspections. But joy tested them too. Graduation robes, a first paycheck, a stethoscope bought with pooled coins and laughter. By the time fate drew a circle between her hospital ID badge and Tunde's admission bracelet, the girl by the kiosk had become a woman fluent in the dialect of breaking and mending, and the woman who once shivered at a closed gate had become a mother who could open any room simply by standing in it. Lagos had taught them the same lesson from different sides of a door, that power without love is brittle, and love without power still builds.
The morning Tunde learned kidneys could fail without asking permission. The city outside kept selling airtime and oranges, as if empires weren't dissolving one organ at a time. Inside, fluorescent light flattened every title into a wristband, and monitors spoke a language money could not tip. The nephrologist mapped the damage like a weather report. Storms in both kidneys, dialysis now, transplant later, caution forever. Tunde nodded with the obedience of a man who had finally met a rule he could not rewrite. His younger wife visited once with sunglasses like a wall and left a perfume that clung to the curtain longer than she clung to his hand. By week's end, she was a forwarding address and a lawyer's voicemail, and home grew cavernous. The board issued reassurances to investors, but spreadsheets tremble when directors do, and the empire he had stacked like glass began to shiver. In the ward, orderlies slid his bed toward a unit where machines did what wounded bodies could not. The first dialysis felt like a negotiation with time, blood circling through coils, cleansed and returned, as if repentance could be piped. He watched ceiling tiles and thought of a village stream, a girl who asked him to meet her parents, an envelope that once felt like a solution and now felt like a sentence. A junior doctor entered. "Good afternoon, Mr. Balogan. I'm Dr. Ijoma Taira." The name lifted a curtain inside him. The room brightened and dimmed at once. He studied her without staring, the careful economy of her movements, the way she listened for more than symptoms, the light behind her eyes that managers try to buy and cannot. She explained creatinine and GFR, listed registries and ethics, set expectations like road signs on a foggy highway. He signed consents in a script that finally trembled, and when she left, he rehearsed a sentence he had never needed: "I am sorry." The hospital ran. Rounds, labs, alarms, and in that orbit Tunde discovered a respect that cannot be invoiced. A porter angling his bed toward sunlight, a nurse warming the stethoscope, a pharmacist explaining side effects without hurry. Nights stretched. He counted regrets like beads. Power had made him fluent in shortcuts. He had traded a doorbell for a rear entrance, a conversation for a cup, a promise for a plan that never included parents. He tried to picture the girl he'd refused at the gate and saw instead the doctor who checked his fistula with gentle fingers and an unblinking gaze. In the staff room, Ijoma stared at his triple-barreled name and felt a tug she dismissed his coincidence. Lagos breeds names in clusters, she told herself. That evening, she set the file's facts on the dinner table between stew and silence. Kamsi steadied her spoon, then her face, and changed the subject with the grace of a woman who knows which boxes hold knives. "Eat," she said. "You cannot pour from an empty cup." Back at the hospital, donor searches began. Blood types, tissue matching, the long bureaucracy of hope. Acquaintances sent lilies as if flowers could filter creatinine. Men he'd financed texted prayers and ghosted logistics. He drafted messages to people he once called friends and deleted them, ashamed to ask for what he had never learned to give. Ijeoma made lists because lists steadied her. Labs to order, consults to chase, questions for next round. And beneath her clinical ink, something older wrote itself. A refusal of bitterness, a curiosity about mercy. On Friday, as rain rehearsed against the awnings, Tunde asked to dictate a letter to his lawyer. Scholarships in a food seller's name, a clinic wing for patients who could not pay, a house returned to a village he had left hurriedly. When Ijeoma returned for evening rounds, she adjusted his pillow and asked about his pain on a scale of 10. "Today," he said, searching for numbers that could carry a history. "Today is a 5, he decided. Then added softer, "But the past is a 9. She wrote the 5 and carried the 9 where doctors keep what charts can't hold, between professionalism and prayer, at the quiet edge of a heart that still believes people can change.
Kamsi woke with the name still ringing in her ears, Balogun, like a door she had once pounded until her knuckles bled, and by mid-morning she could no longer pretend the city was big enough to hide from coincidence. She wrapped a scarf, told Mama Tyra she'd be back before lunch, and rode 2 buses and a prayer to the hospital whose corridors smelled of antiseptic and second chances. At the ward threshold she paused, palms damp, as monitors clicked out the metronome of mortality. Then the door swung, and there he was, Tunde, shrunken inside a gown that made emperors look like men, his face a map of late apologies. The name left both their mouths at once, brittle and breathless. Kamsi? Tunde. Air thinned. Ijeoma, chart in hand, looked from bed to doorway and felt the world tilt, as if a childhood question had just stood up and spoken. "You know each other?" she asked, her voice careful as a scalpel. Kamsi stepped closer, not to touch, but to measure the truth with her own eyes. "We've met," she said, and the room seemed to understand the weight inside those 2 words. Tunde tried to sit up. Contrition broke over his features like bad weather. He began, but Kamsi lifted a hand, and the gesture closed years like a book. "Not this way," she said, steady, not cruel. "Not while you're hooked to machines that clean what you would not." Ijeoma's heart beat against her ribs in a new, unmedicated rhythm. She had trained for fevers, fractures, failing organs, never for a revelation that redrew her bloodline on hospital stationery. Protocol rose like a handrail, and she took it. "Mr. Balogun," she said, professional tone stitched tight, "we'll proceed with today's tests. Ma'am, there's a family area down the hall if you'd like to wait." But family was the word that definited the silence. Tunde's eyes shone wet. "Ijeoma," he tried, tasting the name as if it might absolve him. "Dr. Tyra," she corrected softly, a boundary laid like gauze. She turned to her mother. "We'll talk at home," she whispered, and the promise felt like a bridge over fire. They completed rounds in a choreography of restraint. Fistula check, fluid balance, diet review. Tunde answered with the humility of a man who'd found the edge of his empire. When they left the room, the corridor swallowed them into its hum, and Kamsi gripped the rail as if the building were moving. "It's him," she said. "No drama, just verdict. The gate, the envelope, the night I don't name." Ijeoma stared at the floor tiles, suddenly grateful for grout lines that stayed where they were put. "And me?" she asked, the smallest child and the biggest question. "You are mine," Kamsi said, voice breaking like dawn, "before and beyond any man's decision." At home, stew simmered and boiled over because neither woman remembered to lower the flame. They sat with the windows open to let the noise in, as if the city could crowd out memory.
Kamsi spoke first, piecing the past with calm precision. The contract, the stream, the promise to meet her parents that turned into a glass of juice in darkness. The gatekeeper's lie, the night by the kiosk that became a life under Mama Tyra's roof. She did not flinch, did not embellish. She gave her daughter the truth untinted. Ijeoma listened like a physician and a child at once, collecting facts, managing shock, triaging pain, with tears she didn't wipe, because some salt belongs on the skin. "I asked once if he was kind before he wasn't," she murmured. "You said we live forward, but remember." Kamsi nodded. Memory isn't a weapon, it's a witness. Evening sent the room long shadows and a decision. "I'll recuse," Ijeoma said, the word both shield and sentence. "Another consultant can take over. Ethics demands distance." Kamsi put a hand over hers. "Ethics also demands care. Do what keeps your oath intact and your soul unbitter." The next morning, Ijeoma filed the request for transfer of care, citing conflict of interest. The chief agreed, impressed with her clarity, but understaffing made her the bridge for 2 more days. Back at Tunde's bedside, she stood at chart's length. "Your management will transition to a colleague." He nodded, throat working. "I deserve worse." She didn't answer that. Instead, she explained the transplant pathway again, waitlists, cross-match, the arithmetic of antigens. And when he whispered, "I have no one," she heard the dreadful truth behind the sentence. Not just alone in body, but bankrupt in belonging. In the nurse's station, wordless kindness followed her, an extra cup of tea, a seat surrendered, a palm on her shoulder, and she understood how hospitals keep from collapsing under the weight they hold. Not just science, but fellowship. That night she and Kamsi returned to the table, no stew this time, only water and the kind of silence that heals. If he had come to the village door, Kamsi said, things might have been different. "Ifs don't operate," Ijeoma replied, surprising herself with the iron under the silk. "We deal with what is, and what is that a man may die who could be saved, and we must decide who we are in the shadow of that." The question hovered like a storm cloud with no wind. In the dark before sleep, each woman prayed, one for justice without poison, the other for courage without pride. And somewhere beyond the city's buzz, a nightbird called, announcing nothing and everything, that the past had entered the room, and whatever they chose next would not be the one to decide who they became.
The lab called just after noon, the ring slicing through the hush of the nurse's station, and when Ijeoma scribbled down the numbers, blood type compatibility, preliminary crossmatch glancing green, her breath snagged as if the air had grown teeth. She stared at the figures until they blurred, then carried them home like a fragile bowl. "I can donate," she said, setting the paper between herself and Kamsi, as if distance could dull what it declared. Kamsi didn't sit, she stood very still, as if the right stillness could turn back clocks. And then the refusal burst out of her whole body, not just her mouth. "No. Over my living body, no." The argument unspooled in a fierce, aching loop. Duty versus dignity, oath versus old wounds. 2 women circling the same fire and coming away with different burns. Ijeoma spoke of medicine as a promise, and of love as a discipline, of the poison that bitterness brews and how she refused to drink it. Kamsi set down histories like evidence, nights by a locked gate, a child named Good Journey because survival was a road, the way men learned to take and then call the taking fate, and asked whether the man who emptied their lives should be refilled from her daughter's body. "It's not about what he gets," Ijeoma said quietly when both of them were hoarse. "It's about who we are when no one is clapping."
Silence cooled the room. Outside, a hawker sang the price of oranges, and for a moment life was so ordinary it felt cruel. They held each other then, mother and daughter, letting the anger drain until only fear remained, and agreed on the one rule that could hold them both. If this happened, it would happen without spectacle. No bedside reconciliations, no staged gratitude, only informed consent and clean surgery. The next day, Ijeoma met with the transplant team and the hospital's ethics board, named the conflict of interest out loud, and asked to proceed anyway with the strictest safeguards: independent counseling, a separate surgeon, a different ward post-op. The board read her steadiness the way seafarers read stars, and with conditions said yes. She underwent the battery: EKGs, chest x-rays, renal scans, answering questions about risk the way she answered questions about exams years ago, directly, without bravado. When they asked why, she did not offer scripture or sentiment, only this: because saving a life is not a reward you give a good man, it is a choice you make to remain a good woman. In a quiet corner of the chapel, she left a folded prayer in the wooden box where anonymous hopes go to learn patience. Meanwhile, Kamsi took a bus to the hospital alone and stood in Tunde's doorway with a look that made the nurse instinctively shorten the drip line, as if glass could cut air. He tried to sit, and she stopped him with a palm that once smoothed a baby's hair and now held back a tide. "Hear me," she said, voice low but ironed flat. "If my daughter gives you anything, it will not be because you deserve it, but because she will not let her make her small. If she is harmed, I will lay that harm at your door every day you breathe. If she lives, as she must, you will never speak to her unless she asks. Your gratitude will be paid forward to strangers who can't afford a bed." Tunde nodded like a student who finally understood the lesson late. Tears made his face look younger, and every apology he tried to form sounded like a plea to rewrite a ledger already closed. He called his lawyer after she left and changed things, added a scholarship fund in Mama Tyra's name for girls in white coats, directed land to a village clinic, drafted a letter that didn't plead but confessed, sealed it and wrote Kamsi on the flap. Then took out another sheet and wrote Ijeoma with hands that shook for reasons beyond nephrology. Pre-op week moved with that peculiar hospital tempo, fast when you panic, slow when you pray. Colleagues who rarely hugged now squeezed Ijeoma's shoulder in the elevator. The anesthetist rehearsed side effects twice. The transplant coordinator pressed a list of donors to recruit for future patients so that private courage would seed public good. At home, Kamsi practiced being calm the way some people practice instruments, steadying her voice for the calls to her parents she still hadn't made, laying out her daughter's overnight bag with the precise tenderness of the first day of school, staring at a scar on her own forearm that nobody else noticed, and thinking how every mercy leaves a mark. On the night before surgery, they lay side by side on the rug because the couch felt too formal and the bed too foretelling. They spoke of small things, the best plantain to buy, whether the generator would behave, how Mama Tyra's laugh could shut a door on sadness, and then of the larger thing that threaded all the small ones, the stubborn belief that goodness survives contact with the world. Dawn came like an answer you didn't know you'd asked, and in the pale light of a city yawning awake, they rode to the hospital, fingers laced, two women carrying everything they were into a ward where names are reduced to bands and bands to beeps. In pre-op, Ijeoma signed the last consent and tucked her mother's whispered, "Come back to me," into the pocket where doctors keep pens, and down the hall, in a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain, Tunde closed his eyes and for the first time in a life of acquisitions, waited to receive something without taking it.
The hospital woke before the sun, that particular pre-dawn hush when even machines seemed to hold their breath, and by 6 o'clock, Ijeoma was in pre-op under a warm blanket, wristbands snug, hair tucked, listening to the anesthetist describe the soft slide of sleep as if it were a courteous elevator. Down the corridor, Tunde lay on his back, staring at the ceiling grid, counting squares the way a child counts stars, trying to turn apology into a steady rhythm. Consent forms had been checked twice, then again, as if paper could guarantee flesh. The transplant lead traced the choreography one last time: incision, retrieval, flush, implant, perfuse, while the nurse squeezed Ijeoma's fingers and whispered a joke that trembled into a prayer. Kamsi sat in the family area wearing courage like a tight jacket, rosary knots pressed into her palm, eyes fixed on a TV that moved without sound. When the chaplain paused by her chair, she did not stand, only nodded, the way people do when words feel like sugar on a burn. In holding, Ijeoma watched numbers blink on the wall monitor and practiced her own counting. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 6, until the transplant coordinator slipped in with a file and the polite urgency that means news has outrun protocol. "Dr. Taira," she said gently, drawing the curtain half closed as if privacy could soften data. The final cross-match panel came back with an atypical DSA signal, weak but present. We've looped in immunology. They're concerned about an early antibody-mediated rejection risk. It's not a no, but it's no longer a clean yes. The words were clinical and careful, but their meaning was a skid on black ice. They huddled with the immunologist on speaker. Desensitization options, plasmapheresis cycles, induction agents strong enough to tame a storm, yet gentle enough not to sink the ship. Risks multiplied like reflections, benefits shrank to maybe. The lead surgeon looked at Ijeoma with the sincerity that good operators carry like a second instrument. "We can push forward, but it increases the chance we harm both of you. My recommendation is to pause, optimize, and reschedule with a safer plan." Silence poured in like cold water. Ijeoma nodded once, professional and human, at war beneath her steady face, and asked the only question that mattered. "Is the pause mercy or fear?" "Mercy," the surgeon said, and she believed him because he looked relieved to tell the truth. They rolled her bed back out, blankets still warm, monitors still kind, while down the hall someone dialed Kamsi and asked her to meet them outside the doors. Mother and daughter folded into each other like pages of the same letter, breathing through the sudden space where a decision had lived all week. Tunde received the news in a smaller room where daylight came in at an angle. He closed his eyes and mouthed "thank you" to a god he had negotiated with badly for years, not because the kidney wasn't coming, but because a daughter would not be cut for him today. He asked for paper and wrote 2 lines to Ijeoma with a hand that finally shook for reasons beyond creatinine. "You owe me nothing. Please choose life every time." Then he signed a document the lawyer had left the day before, the pen moving slowly, the way a man walks through a ruined house, touching each wall as if it might remember him. The rest of the day unfolded in the slowed time of almosts. The coordinator canceled theater slots with apologies shaped like kindness. The immunology team drafted a desensitization protocol that read like a bridge built over fog. The nurses adjusted Tunde's dialysis schedule and tucked a soft towel around his fistula arm, an unnecessary comfort that mattered anyway. In the afternoon, the 3 of them, Kamsi, Ijeoma, and the surgeon, sat at a small round table where bad coffee cooled in paper cups and went through the plan. A series of treatments to lower the antibody signal, a repeat cross-match in 2 weeks, a decision tree with branches labeled proceed, reevaluate, decline. Kamsi listened with the focus of a woman who has learned to read maps at night.
When they finished, she asked no questions about science, only one about soul. If we wait, and he dies, will we be able to live with ourselves? Ijeoma answered before the surgeon could. If we rush, and I am harmed, neither of us will. They agreed, not with joy, but with clarity, that safety is a form of love. At dusk, the sky turned the color of diluted hibiscus, and the ward lights hummed into evening. Ijeoma changed out of the hospital gown and back into her scrubs, relief and grief braided so tightly she could not tell them apart. Kamsi took her hand and kissed the small square of tape where an IV had almost been, a ritual for a wound that never opened, but still felt tender. In his room, Tunde asked the nurse to angle the blinds so he could see the slice of sky, and whispered the names he had avoided for years, Kamsi, Ijeoma, Mama Taira, as if saying them could stitch something in place. Machines blept their indifferent lullaby. In the chart, someone typed, procedure deferred, immunologic risk, plan, desensitization plus reassessment. On the walk to the car, mother and daughter moved slowly, matching steps, carrying a strange cargo, decision, delay, a durable resolve to choose life without sacrificing themselves. And just before the parking lot opened to the noisy street, Kamsi squeezed her daughter's fingers and said what she had been saving for when it mattered most. Mercy that keeps you whole is the only kind I can bear.
The days that followed moved like thick syrup, measured in drip counts and the soft clatter of medication trays. And while the immunology team threaded their careful plan, plasmapheresis cycles, tailored induction, a new cross-match penciled for 2 Mondays from now, Tunde's body kept its own counsel, numbers slipping the way dusk slips a city, quietly, everywhere at once. He slept more, appetite shrugged off even soup, and the nurse's notes replaced sturdy verbs with thinner ones, appears, seems, tolerated poorly. Ijeoma worked her shifts with a steadiness that felt borrowed, visiting him as a colleague, not a daughter, charred at the foot of the bed, voice pitched to the calm that patients recognize as harbor. Yet, when she left the room, the calm fell off like a coat, and she stood in the medication room staring at labels as if grammar could hold her. Kamsi came mid-mornings with fruit she knew he wouldn't eat, and a face that refused to let pity dress itself as reconciliation. She sat by the window and prayed the kind of prayer that doesn't barn in, only bears witness. Let truth keep its teeth and mercy keep its hands. Tunde asked fewer questions and listened more, as if the ward's common language, beeps, hushed jokes, rolling carts, were finally teaching him citizenship. On Wednesday he asked for paper and wrote with a boldness that surprised him, a list of gifts he wished he'd given earlier, time, apology, listening. And at the top of the second page he scrawled, "Begin now," and underlined it hard. He asked a nurse to bring the little box the lawyer had left, opened it, and placed 2 sealed envelopes on the tray, Kamsi and Dr. Tyra, resting his palm on them the way a man rests a gate he once closed. That afternoon the team met outside his door, voices low. The plasmapheresis had blunted the antibodies but not the cascade of everything else, and the consultant, a reasonable woman who disliked cruelty disguised as optimism, said, "We treat the patient, not the plan," and changed the order set to comfort-forward care, while keeping hope alive in sentences that didn't lie. Ijeoma stepped in at dusk when the ward lights did their nightly warm hum, and pulled a chair close enough that he could see her face without effort. "Pain?" she asked. "Manageable," he said, then added, "Regret isn't." She did not offer absolution. Doctors are trained for symptoms, not sins, but she did what medicine asks on its best days. She stayed. He told her, haltingly, about the stream and the envelope and the gated refusal, about mistaking shortcuts for roads and money for mercy. When he stumbled, she didn't fill the silence, and when he finished, she said only, "Thank you for telling the truth while it still costs something." Later, Kamsi came and stood where sunlight angled across the floor, a quiet geometry of presence. "I have nothing to take from you," she said, almost conversational, "and nothing to return. We are done tallying. Live the minutes you have like someone who finally learned to count." He nodded, tears finding their familiar track. By Friday night, his breathing had the faraway sound that makes a room lean in. The chaplain came, not with doctrine, but with a story about a thief on a neighboring cross who asked for a kingdom at the last minute and got it, not as a loophole, but as a lesson that doors are for opening. Tunde smiled at the audacity and closed his eyes without fear for the first time in decades. Near midnight, with the ward dim and the city outside roaring like a sea he could no longer hear, he exhaled a long, work-wearied breath and did not pull it back. The nurse silenced the monitor gently, as if quiet could be a kind of respect, and wrote the time in tidy numbers. Grief arrived not like a blow, but like weather, saturating corners. Kamsi felt it settle in her bones the way rain finds old roofs, and Ijeoma felt it as a release twined to an ache, as if a knot had loosened and left a mark where the rope had been. 2 weeks later, in a conference room that smelled faintly of lemons and photocopy toner, the lawyer read the will, his voice a metronome for sentences that tried to make shape of remorse. The companies placed in trust, with Ijeoma as chair and an independent board to keep the gears clean. The Ikoyi house to be sold, proceeds to fund the Mama Tyra Center for Second Chances, a clinic wing for transplant patients who could not afford the long road. Scholarships for girls in STEM from villages where streams still carry mornings. A modest house deeded back in Kamsi's village with a line that read, "For the door I should have walked through." He slid the envelopes across the table. In hers, Kamsi found 3 short lines in the deed. "I do not ask forgiveness. I return what beginnings deserve. Build what I broke." In hers, Ijeoma found the ring he had once used to promise a different woman permanence, and now offered as an admission that permanence must be earned. Plus a note: "You owe me nothing. Spend this life on people who can't pay you back. Let my name be useful, or let it vanish." They left the building into a Lagos afternoon that glittered without apology, and at the curb the wind carried market chatter and bus horns, and the ordinary bravery of a city getting on with it. Mother and daughter stood a moment longer than traffic allowed, feeling the future arrive like an unannounced guest, complicated, insistent, and somehow, finally, theirs to welcome.
In the months after the will reading, life didn't transform with fireworks so much as with fixtures. The kind of changes that arrive wearing work boots, contractors measuring empty corridors for plumbing, donors' names taped to walls in painter's blue, procurement forms breeding in neat stacks. By the time the Mama Tyra Center for Second Chances opened, the old ward smelled of fresh paint and chlorhexidine, and a bronze plaque caught morning sun. For those who couldn't pay, accept with courage. Ijeoma cut the ribbon with the steady hands that had once drawn nephron diagrams in the margins of school books. She hired a social worker who could turn shame into questions, a chaplain who understood silence, a data officer who believed numbers should learn empathy, and a nurse from the dialysis unit who tucked blankets the way some people write poems. Every Friday they held listening clinics, where patients told the long story, how a Buddha crash turned into a bill that turned into a bad decision, how a parent's medicine ate a family's savings and still left an empty chair. And the team mapped help like a city planner drawing new roads. Kamsi, who never liked microphones, became the quiet architect of the center's hospitality. Her stew simmered in the staff kitchen on long consult days. Her eye found the chair that needed an extra cushion. Her kindness invented a protocol for the unspoken. Small envelopes of transport fare passed as if by magic. A shelf of headscarves and slippers for those who arrived cold or bare. The scholarship fund began with a short list, 5 girls from streams and farm paths, each with grades like bright machetes, and grew as the board voted to tie the portion of profits to futures. Acceptance letters heaved through rural post offices, and classrooms far from Lagos whispered new names for possibility. At home, the Ikoyi house sale closed without ceremony. The check arrived like an apology that had finally learned to show its work, and the proceeds poured into bursaries, plasma filters, the kind of unglamorous equipment that keeps goodness from being a speech. When the first patient rang the little brass bell after a successful transplant, 3 short chimes that made the corridor grin, the staff clapped as if the sound itself carried antibodies. In the evenings, when the center's lights glowed like patient constellations, Ijeoma and Kamsi sat on their balcony with cups of ginger tea and the ring glinting on the table between them, not as ornament, not as trophy, but as a paperweight for the past. Sometimes they said his name,
More often, they let it pass by like a bus not meant for them. Eventually, the road back to the village stopped feeling like a dare and started feeling like a duty. They packed modest gifts, fabric, roofing sheets, a blood pressure cuff, and boarded an early bus that bounced through green and red earth, past billboards selling phones and forgiveness. The compound gate creaked as if it too were clearing its throat for a reunion. Kamsi's mother reached the courtyard first, arms wide, voice breaking into the old song mothers sing when lost things return. Her father came slower, shame and relief fighting in his shoulders, and when he finally spoke, the apology didn't grandstand, it bowed. "I was a wall when I should have been a door." "We have both learned carpentry," Kamsi answered, smiling through tears, and the family went inside to trade stories and stew. Word traveled fast. By evening, elders sat under the mango tree while children peered from behind their mothers' wrappers, and Kamsi asked for a small plot near the clinic to raise a 2-room health post with a generator that would fear no storm. The chief agreed, tapping his staff once as if to seal a treaty with the ground. They visited the stream at dusk. Dragonflies stitched the water while an old memory crossed the path and didn't linger. "Not a curse," Ijeoma murmured, watching the current. "Just a chapter." Back in Lagos, governance replaced grief as a daily practice. The independent board kept Tunde's companies honest, pruning vanity projects, enforcing safety audits that treated scaffolding like sacred trust, funneling a slice of profit into the center and the scholarship pipeline with metronomic fidelity. Whenever a patient's bill frightened a family into silence, the center paid what it could and taught what it must: how to ask, how to plan, how to return later as a donor of time or blood or simply belief. On the anniversary of the center's opening, they unveiled a small mural. Mama Tyra laughing, ladle raised. Beneath it, in Kamsi's tidy script, 4 words: "Mercy that keeps whole." That night the city breathed rain and neon, and mother and daughter stood at the window listening to Lagos do what Lagos does: hustle, argue, forgive by morning. "Power without love is brittle," Ijeoma said, repeating the sentence that had threaded their years. "And love without power still builds," Kamsi answered, pressing her daughter's fingers. The lights across the ward winked in patient rhythm, and somewhere a bell rang 3 small times, reminding them that endings can be doorways when you